Because for, say, a constituency like African Americans or a constituency like women, it is a little bit easier to get data and know hard numbers about people who are African American in this country. It's easier to get numbers on people who are Latino or women or what have you. But for LGBT people, and this actually speaks more specifically to trans folks, but also LGBTQ folks as well, that we just don't have the correct or most accurate data around the population, I think. And I'm a big proponent of assuming that there are a lot more of us out there than we have hard numbers for.
Absolutely.
And the barriers are pretty obvious, right? Like many people are comfortable enough to come out. It's, the census data is not inclusive. Any kind of research that's out there about any of the sub-LGBTQ and folks living with HIV groups, like those numbers are just so skewed because we just don't have enough. There's all sorts of different barriers, and we don't have enough resources put in the system to get these people to sort of, be in, like, the system of getting, like, information. So, and there's different projects like the Movement Advancement Project and other kind of sub-think tank LGBT groups that are, tasked with actually gathering that data. But I think, I get hesitant about arguments that, push back against the idea that, because the assertion that LGBT folks are the minority, that we shouldn't somehow be making a federal decision on that. I just don't know that that's democratic. I don't know that in my opinion, in my view of sort of constitutional law, I don't think that that's what it was set up for judgment upon. I think that the reason that this decision came to the Supreme Court was because it's something that the states couldn't figure out, and that the circuit courts began having these conversations because there was too much minutia around all of the different discrepancies between states that had rights and the states that don't have rights, and because the Supreme Court basically operates off of the understanding that if enough circuit courts bring this issue to case, then it's a larger problem for the country and that it needs to be addressed at the highest level. And so for me, it's not even a matter of addressing a question that only affects the minutia of the population. It's more about a question of, is this something that the Constitution inherently guarantees as a right to these people? And the question the Supreme Court answered is yes. And I think that's a completely appropriate place to have that conversation.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think that my difficulty is when people go that the courts shouldn't be deciding this, it should be left up to a popular vote. And that's where I get a little, who are you to tell me what rights I can have and not have with a vote? And you're right. And I think that what's another one of the barriers is just access, right? So even those think tank groups or whatever, or like if somebody puts out a survey, majority of things this day and age it's online. And if you are one of the tons of trans people that are homeless or living in poverty, it's a very difficult situation to try to get access to these type of things or even know that they exist, right? So I absolutely agree with you. Anytime I see kind of statistics, it's like people are always like, well, what are the statistics on the number of trans people that blah, blah, blah? And I was like, well, you can just stop with the number of trans people, because if we don't have those correct, we're probably not going to have whatever extrapolated stats from that correct, right?
Well, yeah, and census is one of the largest information gathering type situations about, the different cultures living in America. And as far as with that data, it's not something that the census is not something that's mandatory. It is, I guess it's voluntary.
Yeah.
More so than not.
Yeah, and
they're not going to show up at your door.
The arguments about sort of, I don't know, basing whether or not we should advance or change things based on population, or even in healthcare, right? Like we see that a lot with trans healthcare, is the you know, oh, like, well, how many trans people are actually going to, like, access this right? Because you get the question of, like, well, if we start including, you know, mastectomies or, you know, what have you in this healthcare plan, then how many of these are going to cost and blah, blah, blah. And the question is, like, okay, even if, you know, let's say, you know, the trans survey done by the task force estimates 700,000 trans people in the United States. Let's round that up perhaps to 1 million, right? And then let's like be generous and say that in 3 years it'll double or triple, right? You got 2 million, 3 million trans people. That is basically like in ratio to the United States population. That is a drop in the bucket, you know. So it's sort of, I always go back to that, and I'm like, you know, how many of us are there really? Maybe quite a few, but not enough to really make it so that we can start pulling out arguments about, you know, these resources shouldn't be there or these rights shouldn't be there for people based on just how few of them there are, you know. So,
right.
But yeah, I hear your point about having folks go to a popular vote about various social issues.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah. So okay. So we've talked, you know, about a couple of ways in which this is a win, and a couple of ways in which it positively affects the trans community. Right. We've got gay trans folks. We've got trans folks that don't identify as gay, whether they identify as pansexual or queer or straight, that could also possibly be affected by it. And you know, based on whether or not they can change their legal gender. But my question is, do either of you see other positives, right? There's got to be other positives out there. If this is really a positive thing, it can't be this one or two things. So other than just the fact that this is a right that we should have, and it positively affects the offspring of those relationships and legitimizing it, you know, whether Jessica, you've seen things in just personally, or Crispin, if you've seen things personally, or even in some of the policy, you know, and advocacy work that you've done, I'd love to hear. I'd love for our listeners to hear about other positive ways that we can look at this marriage equality win from within the trans community specifically.
Well, within the trans community specifically, I think that this is a huge win because now the T is in with the LGBT, and it's been like that. And what greater way for people to actually know that the LGBT exists is by this whole win, because now, you know, there's not just 50,000 people talking about it. There's half the nation or 3/4 of the nation talking about this, about marriage equality, and, you know, and talking about how, you know, and for everything kind of fell into everything just kind of fell into place the way that it was supposed to fall into place, because at the same time you had Caitlyn Jenner coming out. You know, so that was another big topic. So it's like the nation is being, in the world, not just the nation, but, you know, probably I would say around the world too, people are hearing all about the marriage equality, and they're hearing about Caitlyn Jenner, and everybody's kind of getting a sense as to what is going on with the LGBT, which it's more, what's that word I'm looking for? I guess it's more publicity, I would say, for the LGBT community in a sense. And with the talking that's going on, people may not agree, or people. Funny thing, I play Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 3, and, you know, you play with teams sometimes, and I play with a lot of the older crowd, and they were all talking, as soon as that passed, they were all talking about marriage equality. What do you think about it? And it's like, well, you know, I don't really care, you know, I think it's cool, you know, either way they're going to live together, you know, so it doesn't matter. So they should be legally able to get married. And these are, you know, people that are married in a heterosexual relationship and stuff like that. So it's actually gone across the board. So people are actually learning how important this is to the LGBT and how important it is that trans people do exist.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I absolutely hear you on that. I think that, you know, bringing more awareness is always important, you know. I wonder, and we can talk about this in a bit if you want, is that I know that for sometimes that's a good thing, and occasionally we've seen in history there be a backlash. But before we jump on that possible negativity, Crispin, do you see other ways in which this is kind of a win for the trans community that we haven't mentioned?
Yeah, I think the language in the decision is actually something that we will continue to use on the federal level and in all sorts of different, and also on the state level in all sorts of different capacities in litigation for trans people and for all sorts of, protected rights. I mean, the language in there was very explicit about protecting people's, innate rights to be who they are. And
right.
That type of language is something that at the Supreme Court level is pretty exceptional and awfully unique. And it's something that it's going to be how we use Lawrence for years. We're going to pull that out as something that we can continue to make arguments and set precedent for other protections and all protections, really. I mean, it's huge. And I think what's lost a lot of times on folks that aren't in the legal politics advocacy world
right.
is that, yes, of course, there are all sorts of concerns about marriage equality and about the priority and all this stuff, and we can talk about that in a moment. But I think that the piece that's really lost is that in order to make sound legal arguments and change things within the lens of the law, you actually have to have all these other pieces set in place by other pieces of litigation. So Lambda, for example, is an impact litigation organization. So we focus primarily on cases that we are confident that we have a very strong case for and that we know that we're going to win, and we know that, or we don't know if we're going to win, but we know that if we win, we will actually change and impact a huge amount of people. Like we take on cases that we know will impact a huge region or will overturn a policy or overturn a restriction in XYZ area that will then have better and stronger results as it goes forward. So, there's all sorts of different examples of things, but many of the cases that we've taken, have not been at the Supreme Court level, and most of the cases we take aren't at that level, but the reason we take them is because they're in the correct circuit court. That's going to then impact, another decision, or they're in a local municipality in Chicago that will then later help a downstate municipality. So there's all these different pieces of that puzzle that are, and I don't purport to also be an expert in that as well, but I do know that is something that is really in terms of the legal status of same-sex couples that are now able to access their marriage rights, that's revolutionary in terms of the law. There's no way that we are not going to actually utilize that provision now and that language in other pieces of legal writing, and it's just going to mean a lot for trans healthcare, for trans prisoners potentially, for trans ID documents for sure. All sorts of different things. So it's just a matter of time before we start seeing more movement on this. But in order to win those battles for trans people, we have to remember that this is part of a larger domino effect of things that need to be won in order for us to get there. So that I think that for me is, along with of course increased visibility and such. I think that there's just I can't say enough about how much this case is going to mean to the trans community years from now.
So, that was the word I was looking for. Yeah. That was the word I was looking for. Visibility.
Yes. So so what you're talking about, Crispin, is impact and setting precedent.
Right.
Okay. Right. Yeah, and I think that that's important, because a lot of times what happens is that we look at this happened and this is what it means, but we don't really get into, to borrow a word from earlier, to get into the minutia of what it really will, the echo effect, right? And so, yeah, I think that that's a huge win, and that's something I'm very glad you brought up. I think that personally, one of the wins that I kind of see this as, and call this a win, call it not a win, call it positive, call it negative, is that, to your point, right? This is a very important case. This is going to set